Yo, what's going on, guys? Rygo here from MACkite. So I'm still down here in Central Florida and just exploring, checking out the local kite spots in the Tampa area, the St. Pete area, Cocoa Beach, things like that. But since I'm down here somewhere warm, it seemed like a great place just to film some of these fundamental videos for you. And this week I wanted to cover a really common question that I get all the time, and that is, how do I choose the right size kite? And for this question, you could probably narrow it down to 4 points, and that is this your first kite? How much do you weigh? What are the conditions that you're riding in? And lastly, what style of kite are you looking at? Coming back to that first point, is this your first kite? Something you should know about kiteboarding is all kiteboarders have a quiver of kites. Usually anywhere from 2 to 4 kites. I myself like to use 3, and I've got my quiver right here for the trip. So you can see I have 3 kites that I brought with me, and I usually do a 10, 12, and a 14, and that's simply for the conditions that I like to ride in. But when learning, I recommend that you start with a mid-range kite, and what this means is, for your weight, the second point, this is the kite that you're going to be using in the easiest conditions to learn in, with the end goal to be maximizing the amount of time you're going to get on the water in your local spot. So just for a point of reference, I'll run through a quick chart and break down common weights and sizing choices for the mid-range kite, and then we'll get into the case of why you should learn or maybe shouldn't learn on a mid-range kite. So for example, if you're somebody who weighs 220 pounds and up, or about 100 plus kilos, you'll want a 17 to a 19 meter kite. If you're somebody in the 200 to 220 pound range, or 90 to 100 kilos, you would want a 14 to a 15 meter. If you're 180 pounds or 82 kilos, you would want an 11 to a 12 meter. If you were 160 pounds or about 73 kilos, you would want a 10 or a 12 meter. And for those smaller riders in the 140 pound range to 64 kilos, you'd be looking at roughly an 8 to a 9 meter. And then for the smaller riders, 120 pounds, roughly 55 kilos, you're looking at 6 to a 7 meter, maybe even a 5. And if you click that eye icon, I'll include a full chart that has all the different sizes to build the full quiver by your weight. So why learn on your mid-range kite? And the reason I recommend this is because this is going to be the easiest wind range to learn to ride in, that kind of 16 to 21 miles per hour. And what happens is, for example, in our quiver of kites, we have our mid-range kite, our high wind kite, and our light wind kite. So if you do opt for, say, your light wind kite first, these wind ranges actually require a different skill set to learn in. So if you're using a bigger, slower kite, there's going to be more delay in that control bar, which is kind of a perk when you're learning. You know, less response to the kite actually makes less room for user error. But you do have to think 2 steps ahead. So when you're riding on the water, you almost have to sign the kite a bit earlier and then bring it back up a bit earlier to generate apparent wind to get going on the board. And it's actually really practical to go out and stand in the water and learn how to fly the kite on a light wind kite, but it does get more difficult when you're riding. And the same thing for getting out of plane, getting upwind. You're just adding time to the learning process. And likewise, if you opt for your high wind kite, you're going to be going out in gustier conditions. It's usually a bit more hectic, and on top of that, that kite's going to be a lot faster, and this can actually be fun as well. You'll often hear in kite forums and things that people are always amped on their 10 meter kite, and it's true, like a 10 meters is probably the most fun size kite to fly because it is so responsive. But as well, when you're new, when you move to faster kites, there is more room for user error, and everything happens that much faster. So in kiteboarding, we have something called the 30-hour rule. And that is the amount of time that it takes to go from a complete new rider to an independent rider. So 10 hours on the kite, 10 hours on the board, and 10 hours to bring it all together is kind of a good way to look at it. And this really just applies to that mid-range. So if you go to high wind or light wind, you could probably tack another 15, maybe 20 hours to the process, just kind of working on the refinements that come along with these somewhat more difficult wind ranges. So it's really a good idea to start on your mid-range kite, but there are instances, usually coming down to the conditions that you have at the spot you're going to be riding, where it might necessitate that you go for a light wind or a high wind kite. So this is a good example to the other point about where are you riding and what are the conditions you're faced with. So if you're a rider who lives somewhere where the average wind speeds are just always under 15 miles per hour, it's very, very rare for the wind to really get into that range. It might be a better bet to pick the size kite that you're gonna get the most water time in. So for a lot of you, you're gonna have to go for your light wind kite. And you can see the chart in the eye icon that I've linked in to get a good idea of what a good size light wind kite would be for you. But point being, it's really finding that balance between the easiest kite to learn on and maximizing your water time. And likewise, if you're somebody who's living in a location where it's always very, very windy, you might have to get a smaller high wind kite. You know, riders who live somewhere where the wind rarely gets below, 29 miles per hour, you really have no choice but to start with a smaller kite, because again, you really want to maximize your time on the water. Kiteboarding is a sport where after you take a lesson, the more time you spend on the water right after that lesson practicing what your instructor teaches you, the faster you're going to progress. And if you wait too long, you will actually start to forget things, and those skills are going to diminish very, very fast. And the good news here is if you live in one of these spots that happens to have lighter winds or more likely stronger winds, there's going to be a lot of really good kite schools near you. So I recommend linking up with one of those schools and learning from the instructor, or even your local kite shop. And if you don't have either one of those things near you, you can give us a call and we'll happily recommend a good size for you to learn on. Now, the last point that I mentioned, it doesn't really apply to new riders, but riders who might be looking for a particular niche kite, sizing does change a little bit. So if you're that rider who's crossing over to like a freestyle kite or a wave kite, sometimes you might actually need to pick a different kite for your mid-range kite or your high wind kite to cater to your specific needs. But for most of you out there watching this video, that doesn't apply, and I will add more on this point in that written blog as well. So if you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. And as always, this has been Rago, and I'll catch you next week.